stick bowl usually starts in the forest. Although stick bowls can be made out of lilac, juniper, sumac, and other woods that are culled from gardens and around residences, for the most part, stick bowls start in the forest. On my walks through the forest, I find sticks that interest me, and these I pile in a cross-hatch method so that they'll dry and can be picked up later on in the year. I look for especially figured or colorful ends on broken sticks. In the fall, or later on, I will take these sticks back to the shop and pile them to dry. Once they are dry, I will then sort through them to select the pieces that I like the best. Generally, I will leave the pieces to dry over the winter in this fashion. Hardwood takes a considerable length of time to dry, and sometimes these pieces must be left outside for several years. After sorting out the pieces that I want to go on to the next drying phase, I will move them to the garage where they will be under cover but in an unheated situation. After that, we move them inside to a heated environment. Sticks and branches that are to go through this final drying phase have branches or protuberances removed so that they will stack in a more uniform manner. Heated space is limited, and it is imperative that we make the best use of it. Here my apprentice is showing how we do cut these things off very carefully on the bandsaw, always having the piece leveraged against the table of the saw. I have selected a stick from one of the piles in the studio that is dry and ready to work. For this phase, we are going to keep the sticks in sequence and keep the orientation the same throughout the piece. To do this, we're going to draw this line down the length of the piece. This is an arbitrary line which we will use to determine what the top of the piece is. Ultimately, it may not be the top on completion, but at this point it is our orientation line. Next, I cut out my sticks from this larger branch. To determine the length of the sticks, I use a program called CorelDRAW. I have made a separate video as to how I do this, and I explain it in detail. What I have done is I have written the results from the CorelDRAW onto this piece of paper that is sitting on the bandsaw. I set the fence to the measurement of the first stick. This is one way of cutting the sticks. Another way would be to mark out the measurements on the stick itself and cut them freehand. Either way works equally well. It is important to keep a firm grip on the stick while bringing it through the saw, and to make sure that the stick is touching the saw table pretty well where the saw is going through the branch. In order to keep track of the sequential order of the sticks, I put a 1 on both sides of the cut. On successive cuts, I put 2s, 3s, 4s, and so on. Now, I set the fence for the next cut. Each stick is a slightly different length in order to give us the best yield for the vase. There is a lot of repetitive work in making a stick vase, but each element of each step is important and cannot be omitted or passed over lightly. If you are going to attempt one of these vases, please note that I keep a firm grip on the stick as I pass it through the bandsaw. The bandsaw can easily grab the stick and ruin your project at this point. The bandsaw is trying to twist the stick forward, and so when I'm holding the stick, I'm holding it with a slight pressure back towards me. As the blade enters the stick and gets about halfway through, I then change the pressure to forward because the stick will want to twist backwards. Again, because the stick is uneven, it's not a board, it behaves differently. I make a point of trying to understand the characteristics of each stick so that I can cut it effectively without incident and without damage to the piece or to myself. I follow through this process until all the sticks have been cut from the original branch. When all the sticks have been cut, I set them out on the table so that I can see the orientation and where the top of the stick is. You will note here that the odd numbers face us and the even numbers are on the other end. You can also see the orientation line on the top of some of the pieces. The next step is to trim the pieces or square them on 3 sides, leaving the side with the orientation line to the last. It is important that this line be kept visible at all times, or the orientation will be compromised. Making the first cut is tricky because there is no flat surface to either put against the fence or on the saw table. The piece must be held firmly to ensure that the bandsaw does not skew the cut. If a piece has a bow in it, it's easier to put the edges of the bow against the fence and the bowed section towards the saw itself. It's more stable for cutting it. Once the first pass has been completed, successive passes are easier because you have a flat surface. I try to put the flat surface on the saw table for successive passes, although this is not always possible. I also ensure that the orientation line that was drawn originally at the beginning of this video is maintained and not cut off accidentally at this stage. Sometimes when making the first cut, you will find that you're trying to just get a flat surface, and that when you've made the opposite cut, it is necessary to recut the first side to properly square it off. This process is continued until all the sticks have been squared on 3 sides. Again, we look at our sticks. You will note the odd numbers and the double arrows. The double arrows point to the orientation line that was originally on the top piece, and it is still there. I have added double arrows to indicate which is the original up. We are now going to get ready to cut that 4th side, and we will need to know what that orientation is. The smallest diameter piece from top to bottom will determine the thickness that we are going to cut all the pieces at. Here you can see the numbers and the arrows and the top line. This is where we're going to make the cut. The distance between the blade and the fence will determine the thickness of all the pieces to follow. At this point, we have to keep in mind the configuration of the original stick. Most branches are thinner at one end than they are at the other. So when cutting these, the thickness, if we just cut the piece off, we may end up with a slightly disoriented piece, especially on the thicker one. What we try to do then is we will cut off enough to make it square, but not necessarily the actual final thickness. What we do is we move the fence back a bit and cut off enough to get that flat side, and then rejig bring the fence back to the original thickness and cut the other side, so that what we're looking at is basically the center of the stick all the way down its entire length. This will mean that the patterns within the end grains of the pieces will be relatively the same position on each piece, especially when they're adjoining in the actual vase. You will see this when we get to the finished piece. This process continues until all of the pieces have been squared on all four sides. At this point in the video, I am actually cutting one of those thicker pieces, and you will see that I will move the fence to cut off less on the upper side, and then recut the bottom side, keeping the pattern in the center of the piece. When all the pieces are cut, we once again look at our sticks. They are laid out in the same orientation that we have looked at them in the previous several examples. We have the numbers, we have the arrows pointing up, but now we have come to a decision-making time. You will notice that between the two sticks marked 5 and the two sticks marked 1 that there are considerable gaps, whereas between the two sticks marked 3 they are relatively close together. We have to look down the road to future steps, and we have to consider where the chuck is going to go in the vase itself. The chuck needs a fairly solid bed, and that area between the two threes looks reasonably solid. Because the middle area between the two threes looks good and solid, we're going to flip these sticks over and make this side the bottom. When we do this, you'll notice that we've put another arrow on marking the new top side. So the double arrows are going to the bottom and the single arrow is going to the top. This marks the end of part 1 of making a stick bowl.